Shalom, and welcome to our fourth edition of Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson, and today's session is going to be entitled Rabbi Jesus. Now, we're kind of shifting gears. We're going to get really into the heart of what this is going to be about beginning today. The first three were really introductory type teachings. We started with the whole idea that the Bible was written for us, but not to us. So to understand more of the Bible, we need to go back into that world that the Bible was written actually to understand the culture, geography, the history, everything about it becomes very, very significant. Then the second session, I give you an overview of Israel. I thought that's important. We're going to be zooming in on many, many locations throughout the coming sessions, specific areas, much, much closer because we were looking specifically at certain teachings. And then last session was about Jerusalem, which obviously is central, and we'll be going there a lot. That'll be very, very significant. And those are overviews that I thought kind of lays the foundation. But beginning now, we're going to start to look at Jesus' teachings, which is going to be the heart of what we're going to be doing. And today, it's entitled Rabbi Jesus, because we're going to look at him as a rabbi, how he taught using rabbinic teaching techniques. First of all, the name Jesus that we use came from the original Hebrew word Yeshua, which means Yahweh or the Lord is salvation. And that actually is what Jesus would have heard during his time on earth. He would have been called Yeshua. Later translated into Greek, Iesus, in Greek is the way I guess that is pronounced. And then there was an English, was like a transliteration, which happens very often. Become from Iesus, become Jesus. So that's where we got our name, Jesus. Now, obviously, it's not wrong to use the term Jesus because it's an English version. But his original, in the time he lived here, he would have been called Yeshua. Now, there are 7 different groups or types of people, at least, who refer to Jesus as Rav, which means rabbi, also means teacher or master. Now, during Jesus' day, that was a title. It later became a formal position. So it was simply a title. Some of the people that called him a rabbi were, of course, his disciples. I got references here. I'm not going to read all these, but I just have them listed. The Pharisees did. John the Baptist's disciples. The common people. The Torah teachers, and we'll look in a minute what that means, Torah teacher. Herodians. The Sadducees. And obviously Jesus himself. All referred to Jesus as a rabbi. Now, the expression he uses very often is, "You have heard it said, but I say." Now, I think we all understand that he's going to what's going to happen after this expression is something very, very important. He's laying a foundation. But beyond that, this expression had meaning in that world. And what it meant was this. There were two types of rabbis in ancient Israel. The majority, by far the vast majority, were called Torah teachers. They were, in the Bible, often referred to as teachers of the law, probably 95%. Then there was a very small number, maybe 5%, 10% at the most, called rabbis with shemika, a Hebrew word meaning authority. So when Jesus used that expression, he was using an expression that only those rabbis could use, the rabbis with authority. And that specifically identified him. Now we know he was the Son of God and Messiah, obviously too, but in that culture he was a rabbi with authority. And the Bible kind of backs that up here in Matthew because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. So there we go. We got those two right put together. Teachers of the law were the Torah teachers. Now, an expression I want to look at right now, there are several expressions from back in that world that got kind of mixed up and certain people reinterpreted them, into things that they wanted them to mean. And one of them is this verse right here. Become very, very controversial. And there are many, but I'm just pointing out a couple. The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. Now this is a King James translation. It's unfortunate. It's not a good translation. But from that became a lot of misinterpretations. A lot of people were trying to turn Jesus into something different than who he was. And that being during the so-called silent years from age 12 to 30 when he became a rabbi, there are people said he went to India and he studied in India. So he's learning all about Hinduism. And what he's saying right here is an idea from Hinduism called the chakra, the third eye, this single eye. Well, that's not true, which we'll look at in a second. Another expression that he referred to, which greatly misinterpreted, and we'll be looking at in this study, a whole session on it, the kingdom of heaven, is very much misinterpreted different times, and trying to put Jesus in that same category again. Now, in the NIV, the interpretation is a lot better of that particular verse. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are good, now that word is ayin tova in Hebrew, your whole body is full of light. But if your eyes are bad, ayin rava, ayin is eye, ra is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. Okay, that translation is much clearer. Now, this is a really well-known rabbinic expression. I ran into this all the time. Back in Jesus' time, they would say ayin tova during their teachings. And ayin tova simply meant look favorably on your brother. Be generous. Have a good eye. That's what it meant. That's it. It had nothing to do with India or Hinduism or anything else. That's what it meant right there. And it's with a little bit of work studying it, it can be found very quickly. A bad eye was the opposite, being very negative, stingy, the kind of person a lot of people don't want to be around because they're kind of negative all the time. They're looking bad on people. And Jesus and the rabbis would say ayin tova. And that comes from many references in the Proverbs, chapters 22 and 23. Now, we're going to look at 5 different kind of methods of rabbinic teaching today, just very briefly. First mention, hyperbole, something called kesher, answering questions with another question, and a very well-known technique called parables. Okay, first of all, first mention. Now, this is really significant because the whole idea of concepts, any concept in the Bible, is the first mention is really important. It's so important to go back and look at it because that becomes the foundation of what that word is or concept is going to mean. So, in every single case, that first mentioning of whatever word or concept is going to be in the Torah. So, in other words, the Torah is going to become the foundation. Now, I'm not going back and putting us on the law or anything like that. That's not what's happening. We are looking at the idea that this Torah is so significant in understanding the basis of what is to come. So what did Jesus say about his idea of the original scriptures that we call the Old Testament? He said, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law," okay, or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill them. Now, these words abolish in Hebrew means to misinterpret. The word fulfill means to interpret correctly. So that's what this means, exactly what it means. And this was on the Sermon on the Mount. He said these words. And then he went on to say, "I tell you the truth until heaven and earth disappear. Not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of the pen will by any means disappear from the Torah until everything is accomplished." So, that's a pretty high view. That's an extremely high view of the Torah, of the original scriptures here. Because he's saying it's all going to be fulfilled. Everything, including the smallest letter. Now, in Hebrew, there are 22 letters. And they had actually no vowels back in those days, just letters. Vowels were a much more modern day occurrence. But the smallest letter he's referring to is the one insert below, called a yod. It's a tiny letter. It's way smaller than anything else. And the least stroke of the pen is that little curl on top. So what he's saying is even a little yod in all these verses, all that's going to be fulfilled. So that's the viewpoint that Jesus had towards the Torah, which is important for us to understand. He said, If you believe Moses, you would believe me, or he wrote about me. Wow. So Moses wrote the Torah, the first 5 books. So that means that Jesus is in the Torah. He's being referred to in the Torah over and over and over again. And we'll be looking at that a lot in the coming sessions, what that means. Now, the word Old Testament that we use actually was coined in the 2nd century. But in Jesus' time period and before, and actually even today in Israel, it's called the Tanakh. And that's an acronym. Now, an acronym means simply you take certain letters and put them together. So the T is from Torah. The N is from Nevi'im, which means prophets. And the K is from Ketuvim. There were no chapters or verses until the year 1200s, believe it or not. So these Torah scrolls, these biblical scrolls, were just like one continual passage of all kinds of words put together. So it's pretty amazing how they could read them. Okay, now my trips to Israel, when I refer to the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures sometimes called, not as the Old Testament, if I say Tanakh, I have noticed Jewish people kind of look at me and smile like they appreciate that. Now the word Torah comes from Yara. Now, Hebrew words and Hebrew thinking is very picture-oriented, including the words. In fact, the original Hebrew language was a picture language. They were all pictures. We'll look at that later in some other session. It's pretty cool. But the word Torah, coming from Yara, is an archery term, believe it or not. It's an archer pulling his bow back and aiming his arrow at his target, and he hits a bullseye. It means hitting the mark. Now, is the Torah strictly an archery term and that's all it means? Well, clearly not. It's symbolic of hitting the mark of life. To follow God's instructions or teachings so you have a full life. Like Jesus said, I am coming you might have an abundant life. So that's what it means. That's actually where it's from. All right, we're going to look at 2 examples of first mention. One of them briefly and the other but a little bit more extensively. But the first one is atonement. Second one is faith. Let's look at atonement first. So where does that word first mention in the Bible? And this might seem pretty surprising to you. But here it is, this picture. Noah and the ark. That's where it's first mentioned. Now how in the world would that be true? Well, here's the scripture. Way back in Genesis 6:14. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it. And coat, the word is kafar, it with pitch inside and out. Kafar is the word for atonement. It's the original mention of the word atonement. Now, if you think about it, when this ark is floating on this water, this flood, this huge waterway, this ocean, in the Bible, the Jews are land people, not sea people like the Philistines. The Bible, or the oceans always represent the abyss, always represent darkness, death. So here you have this boat of life floating over death, and it's being saved by the fact it's floating. Now, Moses was instructed to make it a certain way, as you remember from the scriptures, all these details, but he used these boards put together. But the boards, if they just used them, just separate boards and kind of put one on top of the other, and he floated it, picture this, the water would seep in. It could get between the boards. So God said to coat it with pitch. Now, this is a picture here. This is the first mention. What does this mean? If the coating, the pitch wasn't there, what would happen to the ark? It sunk. Would have made it. So the atonement, the kafar, the pitch, brought life. So this idea from the beginning is going to be carried throughout the scriptures. And I'm only going to look briefly at one other thing here. And that there's so many other steps throughout, but I'm just looking at one. Of course, the big one is this. Is the coating that the Israelites were told to put under doorways when they're going to escape Egypt was what? And the passage is, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. So this was the protection from the death plague on Egypt. If the Israelites had this blood coating, they would be safe, this covering over their doorways. And of course, we know later it is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. So this is a picture that's going to gradually be carried through to the cross, which will preserve life, which will save you through the blood of Jesus. And obviously there's a lot more details, but that's just a quick look at that. The second one I want to, and also I'm going to mention this, going back to that first week, Greek is what must I know idea. Hebrew is what must I do. So there's a difference there. Now in the New Testament, the word for faith is pistis. Pistis means persuaded to agree, come to trust, or a gift from God. Okay, that's what the word means in the New Testament. In Hebrew, the Old Testament, it's emunah. Emunah means firmness, steadiness, persistence. Now, it's an action word. Actually, all these words are in Hebrew. They're all action words. There's things you have to do in order to establish emunah, faith. It's all based on action. As we're going to look at two examples here, actually. The very first mention of it is Abram. He was called Abram at that time, when God asked him to leave Ur, a very, very pagan city. It's likely Abram's dad was an idol maker, even. History seems to indicate. But he come out of this pagan world, and God called him to go to this place. He had no idea where it was. He had to just follow his instructions and take everything with him, his family, flocks and everything, relatives. And he did it. He did it. It was amazing. He believed God, so he decided to do what God said. So it's action. He is going to do what God said. He traveled up to Haran and then on down to Israel. He believed emunah, the Lord, and it's credit to him as righteousness. So here we go. We have the idea of emunah is action. You have to do what God says. The second use I'm going to look at here, I want to look at the second use of that term because I think it's kind of interesting and pretty instructive too, was when the Israelites, after they had escaped Egypt, not soon after that, they found themselves in the middle of a battle. So they're kind of standing up on top of this hill, and the Amalekites are beneath. And the Amalekites have this huge army, and the fighting is going to begin. And it would be pretty tough for the Israelites to be prepared for this at that point. Joshua being the commander, so Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered. Okay, and Moses and Aaron and Hur went to the top of the hill. Now God is going to instruct Moses to hold his hands up in the air, which seems pretty different, pretty weird. As long as Moses did this, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, because he couldn't hold them up all the time, actually he was pretty elderly already at this point, probably at least 80, they took a stone, Aaron and Hur, and they put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained emunah, steady till sunset. So here's the action. Moses, put your hands up in the air. And he was getting tired, so he had to have help. But that's actually the picture. And when he was doing that, they were winning. They were winning the battle. So this whole idea, faith is action, persistence, steadiness. But there's another picture here, I think. Moses couldn't do it by himself. His arms got tired. What happened? He needed help. Moses needed help. He needed help from Aaron and Hur. They had to help him hold his hands up in the air. And I think it's a teaching for us. Sometimes we need help. We need Aaron and Hur. We need friends by us to help hold our hands up in the air during tough times, to have faith. Now, the word for faith, actually the word amen, is from aman, which is kind of a root word of emunah. It means the same thing. And it was used to seal covenants. It's a very, very strong word. Sometimes that word amen is used in church, but it was used to seal covenants and accept God's kingship in your life. So it was very, very strong. It meant, yes, I'm going to practice emunah. So the end result was Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with a sword. Okay, after the help of Aaron and Hur. Now, many lessons from this. Um, God asking him to do this, does that make sense? No. How could it? And we have things in our life that seem like they don't make sense. Why did this happen to me? Why did this happen over here? So many things. It means another lesson is obviously sometimes we need help. And I think the other thing significant about this story is they sat him on a rock, on a stone. I think that's symbolic of the rock, actually Jesus, the cornerstone, being the foundation of everything. Now, the second teaching we're going to look at is called hyperbole. There was no Hebrew word for that, actually. It was making a point by exaggerating. This is really common in the ancient world. It's used all the time, even before the scriptures were written, hyperbole. Now, there are many rabbinic teachings about judging fairly. If someone urges you to remove the speck from your eye, he must be given the answer. Take the plank out of your own. Okay. Now, this is an example of hyperbole. And this is Jesus speaking, which is, you can kind of picture that, this plank in your own eye. How could you see the speck in your brother's eye? You need to get that out. And it's pretty clear what he's teaching here. Only then can you help others. We take care of ourselves. So when Jesus said this, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? I think his listeners understood. But this is an example of hyperbole. Now, obviously, they know that's not literally a plank in the eye, but they understand it. Another one, Jesus teaching about camels and gnats. This is kind of an interesting one here. I'm just using a couple examples of hyperbole. Jesus is speaking to the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, and he's also, of course, speaking to us about a camel and a gnat. What's that about? He said, you strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. Wow, what does that mean? That sounds pretty weird. But this has meaning back in the world, so we got to go back there to understand it. Now, we're not going to read all this. This is the chapter of Leviticus that mentions the animals that are clean and unclean, the kosher animals, the clean ones. And the unclean ones are listed in this part right here. The largest one mentioned is a camel. Right there, towards the beginning, I got it marked or kind of highlighted. And towards the bottom, the smallest ones are flying insects. These are the list of animals they couldn't eat. Not that you'd want to eat insects, but these were listed. And there's reasons for this. God is instructing his people in terms of cleanliness and healthiness is part of it. But it's also to honor him. Here's what I'm telling you. To do not eat these, you can eat these. So the smallest is the insect. The largest is the camel. Okay, of this instructions. So the smallest non-kosher creature is would be a gnat, an example here. That's what Jesus is referring to in this teaching. And the largest one is the camel. All right, let's look a little bit closer here. This is an ancient wine press. The wine is crushed in that area where the arrow starts. And there's a little trough where the juices, I should say, the grapes were crushed. The grapes were put in there and they were smashed and crushed, sometimes with feet, other times with stones. And the juice flowed down into that container right here. This is an ancient wine press that was used. Many of these found in Israel. Okay? And another picture of it here. So let's look at this again. So we're gone like this. This is actually another view here that kind of shows it better. So there it goes. It would have gathered in this particular area. Now, swatting gnats, the smallest animal, okay, what was the idea behind that? Well, why would they swat gnats? When the juices were taken from that trough, where the juices were flowing, where the wine juice was, originally grape juices can turn into wine, was collected, they put them in these wine skins. When they did that, they had to be really careful that gnats that would come in, we've all had the problem with gnats before, and they'd try to get inside of the wineskin. And they had to kind of quickly close it before those gnats got in, because if even one gnat got in, the wine is no good. Couldn't use it. It's non-kosher because the gnat was a non-kosher animal. So they swatted gnats. Keep the gnats out of here. They swatted them. Okay. Now that's not a bad thing. They want to keep the wine pure. So that's what they had to do. Swatting gnats. Now, if we look at kind of a bigger picture for us, what is Jesus saying here? Swatting the gnats, these small things. He's saying that if we concentrate on small things, sometimes we can miss the big thing. And that's what this teaching is about. So what is the big thing? The camel, the big camel versus the little tiny gnat. Okay, so if we're busy swatting the gnats to keep that, in this case, wine pure, but we're missing the idea of swallowing a camel, that's exactly what Jesus is teaching, to not do that. So what does he mean by swallowing camels? Let's look at this closer. So in everything do to others what you would have them do to you. This sums up the law and the prophets. So clearly, he's saying this whole idea of having a good eye to love your brother and sister is the most important thing. That's the camel. That's what that is. Love, to really have the Jesus heart towards other people. Now, I think this is so significant. When Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, getting ready he was crushed by the weight of the world to go to the cross, he prayed this, that they may be one as we are one. May they be brought to complete unity in order that the love you have for me may be in them. And this happened right before the cross. The whole idea of love, that they would be filled with love, was his prayer before the cross. And that is very significant. Now, as I mentioned before, hyperbole is used extensively in the ancient world. And I'm just very briefly going to mention something else here. This is not directly Jesus' teaching here, but something else is significant. In the Bible, we have a lot of hyperbole mentioned in terms of especially when Joshua and Israelites came into Israel, they use the term very often, utterly destroyed or wiped out. And if you read those accounts, and that of course is troubling for people to understand the violence in the Old Testament, what does that mean? Well, if you read those accounts, many of them, actually most of them, if you keep reading, you'll find out, wait a minute, they said utterly destroyed, but then in the next chapter, they're still here. Well, these people are still here. So why did he say that? What's going on? Well, this actually is hyperbole. It meant something beyond. It meant trying to wipe out their idolatry, that type of thing. But they didn't actually kill everybody. There's only 3 places where this actually did take place. And they're all military outposts. Of course, Jericho, as we know. And these were all burned, too. A place called Ai, which is not so far away. And then a massive fort in the Galilee area on the Via Maris called Hatzor. They were utterly destroyed. They were utterly wiped out. So I think it's important to understand that. It doesn't explain everything, but it kind of gives us a bit of a perspective. Those cities were utterly destroyed because they were military outposts. And another example in the New Testament of John used hyperbole, because this is very common. He said Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have enough room for the books that would be written. Now, clearly that's not true, because Jesus was, about 3 or 3.5 years, and all the books in the world, so that's just a hyperbole expression, but he's trying to just say in a bigger picture how the significance of Jesus' teachings. Okay? Now, if you think about it, we use hyperbole too. For example, I live in a little town called Central Lake, and there's a town nearby called Bel Air. And I've seen before in accounts where, let's say, Bel Air beats Central Lake in football, and there could be a headline saying Bel Air crushed Central Lake, or Bel Air annihilated Central Lake last night in football. So if in many, many years in the future, if somebody was to come upon that statement, it sounds like, wow, that's crazy. These towns are just wiping each other out. So anyway, just to point that out, there's this element in the Bible. I'm not going to go into more depth at this point, but that does exist. Now, the next one is called kesher. This is a really, really big one, which means connection. And which means the answer to a question is not contained directly in the text quotes, but in the verses surrounding the text. In other words, if somebody asks a question, then the rabbi or whoever is answering the question would answer it with a passage that's not the answer, but the answer is either before or after the passage. Now think about that. The ability to understand the scriptures, to memorize the scriptures, would have to be incredible. You would have to recognize what surrounds the answer in the Bible to even know what they're saying. I'm going to look at some examples of what this means. And Jesus used this a lot, this idea of kesher, or connecting. And the amount of knowledge of the scriptures would be insane. It'd just be amazing. Many of these rabbis had the entire, what we call Old Testament or Tanakh memorized, all of it. Now, here's an example of this. But when the chief priests and teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did, and the children were shouting in the temple area, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. Now, right before this, there had been, of course, the Son of David idea. I mentioned this last week. The crowds are shouting Hosanna to the Son of David, which meant like the military leader. So there's that part of it. But if we go on here, it says, "Do you hear what these children are saying?" They asked Jesus. "Yes," replied Jesus. "Have you never read, 'From the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise'?" Now, does that answer the question? What does that have to do with it? Well, this is a kesher. This is a connection. He's answering their question by saying this, but the answer is right next to that in the scriptures. And what's interesting is they apparently knew the scriptures because they understood. And the kesher is from Psalms. It's a reference to Psalms 8:2. "From the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise." But then the next part is this: "Because of your enemies, to silence the foe and the avenger." Wow, what just happened here? What did Jesus just call these people? And they were mad. He just called them the foes and the avengers very boldly by this kesher. And we would miss this if we didn't understand how this works. And there's a lot of these. There's so many of these that Jesus used, and other rabbis. It's very, very common. Now, another one is answering a question with another question. And this is kind of a neat way to do it. Now, here's an example. This is not from the scriptures, but just a story. This is an example of a rabbi who's also a painter who painted these 4 pictures. And a lady walked up to him and said, "These are great. Which one's your favorite?" Now, the rabbi didn't say anything for a minute. He just looked at her and said, "Do you have children?" And she had to be like, "Wow, what's this about? Do I have children? I'm asking what your favorite painting is." What is he saying here? He's saying, "Do you have children? Which one is your favorite?" So in other words, I love them all these paintings. So I shouldn't have to single this out. So this is an example of answering a question with another question. This is kind of a classic Jewish Hebraic technique. Now, let's go to a specific passage here. Every year, his parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the feast according to the custom. After the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Now, that might seem weird. How could they be unaware of it? Well, they traveled in massive groups, really large groups for protection. So that actually could happen more easily than what you would think. Thinking he was in their company, because they assumed he was with all the other kids in another group, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him. Wait a minute, he's not with these kids, among their relatives and friends and all these kids. So they realized they're panicking. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him because they realized he must be back there. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts. what was going on. They had to be incredibly relieved to find him. He was sitting among the teachers, listening to them, asking them questions. Everybody who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. So, in other words, Jesus is doing exactly this. They're doing this, answering a question with another question. And the rabbis recognize this as this 12-year-old boy is doing this even at that age, which is really amazing. Now, this one is one I really love here. Not that the other ones aren't interesting, but I particularly like this one. It says, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality and teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Jesus is going to say to him, "Show me a denarius." Okay? Now, it was a very common practice back then for the conquering kings and the Caesars to have images of themselves everywhere. And that would include coins. They'd put their images on coins. And then they would place these images throughout the country. And of course, the coins are being used. Everybody saw their picture everywhere. Now, here's an actual coin that was used back then of the Roman emperor. Excuse me. So they produced a denarius, and on that denarius would be the Roman emperor. Okay, now it's significant. The front is on the left side here. Jesus caught them by producing a coin with a graven image, which is what that is, on it. So by them pulling out this coin, he's saying they're literally, probably in a sense, being embarrassed. We've got a graven image. And then here's what he said, which is so interesting. "Whose portrait and inscription are on it?" "Caesar," they said. He said to them, "Then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." What is Jesus alluding to here? Now, this happens to be my oldest grandson, he's 20 years older now when he was young. What is Jesus saying? Give to God what is God's? For his last act of creation, God said, "Let us make man in our own image." The rabbis would say a king mints 1,000 coins with his image on them, and every one is the same. But the Lord makes multitude of human beings that bear his image, and they're all different. Wow. What a powerful teaching. He's clearly saying that you were made in the image of God. And Caesar, that's on his coins, give him what the taxes are, but understand you are in the image of God. So that image you give back, or yourself give back to God. Let us make man our image. The Hebrew translation for image is salem, and I put this on there because I think it's interesting. It means shadow. So we're not God. We're an image of God. So if you look at this shadow of this tree, we get an idea what the tree looks like. It's not the tree. So we're to be the shadow or the image of, in our case, Jesus, his teachings, so that people could see by the image, they could want to know who is the tree. What is the tree? And get an idea. The rabbi said not even the angels bear his image. When the angels see a human approaching, they say, "Stand aside, stand aside." The image of God is approaching. This is a rabbinic statement that's really, really famous. And this is kind of an interesting one, too. I just thought I'd put it in here. A rabbi was returning from a Torah study. Now, a very ugly man saw him and said, "Peace be on you, Rabbi." And then the rabbi said, "Raka." That means empty head. How ugly you are. Is everyone in town as ugly as you? Wow. The man replied, "I do not know, but go and tell the craftsman who made me, how ugly is the vessel you have made." Wow. did he ever in this little teaching. The rabbis are very self-deprecating in that sense. They would do this to teach themselves as to what should the perspective be. But clearly, everyone is made in the image of God, and that's the lesson here. Now, the last one we're looking at right now is parables. And parables, the rabbis of ancient Judaism made extensive use of parables to better understanding living out the Bible. And we are going to look at many examples of parables. And we're going to look at one of them. I'm going to designate all the next teaching to just one, the prodigal son. It's a very, very powerful story, and told in its context, it's even more fascinating, I think even deeper. And it would be the listeners to this parable that Jesus talked about or gave to his listeners actually would have been shocked at some of the statements, some of the details of the parable itself. And we'll be getting into various examples of these parables, these teachings, as time goes on. So thank you for listening to this 4th edition of Contextual Bible Study. Shalom.